I'm Teisha Bader with Shalom TV's news update for Wednesday, March the 12th, 2014. A rocket was fired from Gaza into southern Israel last night. The projectile landed and exploded in an open area in the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council. No damage or injury was reported. British Prime Minister David Cameron addressed Israel's Knesset today, where he stated his support for the Jewish state and commitment to Israel's security, and that he would always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself. Cameron said that British support for Israel was, quote, rock solid. With me, he said, you have a British Prime Minister whose belief in Israel is unbreakable. Cameron also spoke of his efforts in Britain to combat anti-Semitism, to educate about the Holocaust, and to protect the religious freedoms of the Jewish community in Britain, like the laws of ritual slaughter or shechita. He also stated Britain's opposition to boycotts against Israel. The British leader expressed his hope for peace between Israel and the Palestinians and his support for U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry's current peace efforts, while recognizing that the process was a very difficult, painful, and challenging one. He said he would not tell the Israelis and Palestinians how to achieve this peace, but ask them to imagine what the world would look like if, in fact, a two-state solution could be reached, if an end to the conflict could actually be attained. How such an achievement could impact Israel for the better. After landing earlier today at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport, Cameron said he had come to the area to do whatever he could to encourage Israeli and Palestinian leaders to make bold and courageous choices to make the two-state solution a reality. Cameron met today with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli officials. He will meet tomorrow with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. It is his first official visit to Israel since becoming Prime Minister in 2010. A bill to draft the ultra-Orthodox into the Israeli army overwhelmingly passed in the Knesset today, 67 votes in favor and 1 opposed. Israel's opposition party refused to participate in the Knesset hearings on the draft law and 2 other measures, boycotting the vote, leaving the Knesset nearly half empty. Bayit HaYehudi member Ayelet Shaked, who led the draft legislation, called the bill historic. She said for 65 years there was an exemption for all yeshiva students, and the change the coalition made is proportionate and gradual and correct. The legislation stipulates the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox into the IDF over a 3-year transitional period. It also states that draft evaders would face criminal charges after that 3-year period. It attempts to create a more equal sharing of the burden of military service across Israeli society. Right after the vote, the Movement for Quality of Government petitioned the High Court against the bill. Shaked said she expected the judges of the High Court to review the bill tomorrow, and she believed that they would ultimately allow it to pass. The ultra-Orthodox community in Israel deeply opposes the legislation and recently held mass demonstrations in Jerusalem against it. The Jerusalem Post reports that the Shin Bet, Israel's security agency, and Jerusalem police announced the arrest today of a Palestinian man suspected of cutting gas lines in apartment buildings in the Jerusalem neighborhood of East Talpiot in an attempt to harm the Jewish and Israeli residents living there. 48-year-old Aziz Musa Uwisat, who is a resident of East Jerusalem neighborhood Jabal Mukaber, confessed during questioning. He said that after hearing about a gas leak in January that caused a building to collapse in another neighborhood, killing several residents, he decided to pursue the sabotage. He said it was in revenge for the entrance of Jews to the Temple Mount and Israel's actions in Gaza. Last week, residents of the East Talpiot neighborhood smelled a strong gas odor and alerted police, who discovered 2 deliberately cut gas lines and were able to avert any incident. Uwisad is also suspected of a knife attack back in 2012. He's known to police in the past as a Hamas operative.
Informal voice. And the weight
Former American ambassador to Israel Samuel Lewis has passed away. Lewis died Monday at his home in Virginia at the age of 83 after battling lung cancer. He was a career diplomat who joined the Foreign Service in 1954 and served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel from 1977 to 1985, seeing more than his fair share of historic and dramatic events, such as Israel's 1979 peace treaty with Egypt, in which he played a key role. Also the Camp David Accords and the start of the First Lebanon War in 1982. After completing his service in Israel, Lewis returned to the country over 50 times to visit. During his time as ambassador, Lewis, who was not Jewish, was nicknamed Shmuel Levi by then Defense Minister Ezer Weitzman because Lewis was so involved in the day-to-day goings-on between the U.S. and Israel and was so interested in Israeli and Jewish culture. The think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, on whose board Lewis had served, called him a legendary diplomat, saying he had performed, quote, miracles in terms of interpreting the U.S. to Israel and vice versa, often facing harsh criticism for his efforts. The Institute said, thanks in no small part to his creativity, sensitivity, and personal charm, the U.S.-Israel relationship flourished on his watch, as Washington not only mediated peace between Israel and its largest and most powerful neighbor, but also laid the foundation for the bilateral U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. They said decades after he left Israel, Sam is still remembered by both Americans and Israelis as the standard to which all others are compared. Lewis is survived by his wife Sally and their children. The Anti-Defamation League has praised Norwegian cruise lines for dropping Tunisia as a port of call on its cruises. The cruise line made the decision after Israeli citizens aboard the Norwegian Jade had been barred from disembarking in Tunisia, as we reported to you earlier this week. Online cruise information site Cruise Critic cited Norwegian's CEO Kevin Sheehan, saying, "We want to send a strong message to Tunisia and ports around the world that we will not tolerate such random acts of discrimination against our guests." ADL National Director Abe Foxman lauded the course of action. He said, "We applaud the courageous and responsible decision of Norwegian Cruise Line in standing up to the discriminatory policy of the Tunisian government." Foxman said they have sent a clear message to Tunisia and other governments that discriminatory practices against Israelis and other nationals will have a negative impact on tourism. The ADL had written a letter to Sheehan after the incident aboard the Jade. Former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg is expected to arrive in Israel in a few months to accept the first Genesis Prize. It was announced last year that the mayor would be honored with the inaugural award for his leadership and philanthropy. Bloomberg has said that he would donate the $1 million prize to improving trade relations between Israel and the Palestinians. The Genesis Prize is overseen by the Prime Minister's Office, the Jewish Agency, and the Genesis Philanthropy Group, which was founded by Jews from the former Soviet Union and promotes Jewish identity among Russian-speaking Jews throughout the world. Bloomberg, whose grandparents immigrated to the U.S. from Russia and Belarus, will attend the ceremony to receive the prize in May. A theater devoted to the story of Anne Frank is set to open in Amsterdam this spring, just ahead of the 70th anniversary of Anne Frank's deportation to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1944. She died of typhus in the camp in 1945. The theater will feature a permanent production about Anne's life, a play simply called Anne, which was developed at the request of the Anne Frank Foundation, a nonprofit founded in 1963 in Basel, Switzerland, by Anne Frank's father and sole survivor of the Frank family, Otto Frank. The play is set to debut in May and will feature a cast of approximately 20 Dutch actors with simultaneous translation to 7 languages. The new theater seats 1,100 people, and Yves Kugelman of the Frank Foundation said that royalties from ticket sales will go towards the foundation's educational work and charity projects for Jewish and non-Jewish causes. And turning to our Shalom TV programming for tonight, Wednesday, March the 12th, more of our coverage of the recent AIPAC National Policy Conference held in Washington, D.C. begins tonight at 7, with remarks from New York Senator Chuck Schumer and remarks from U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. That is followed at 9:30 with L'Chaim, when Mark Golub is joined by Esther Waxman. mother of murdered Israeli soldier Nachshon Waxman, who was kidnapped and killed by Hamas terrorists in 1994. That's tonight here on Shalom TV and shalomtv.com. And that's Shalom TV's news update for Wednesday, March the 12th, 2014. I'm Teisha Bader.